All right, let's dive right into this explainer. You know, if you're a field officer or working with a community organization or a small NGO out in Ghana, I bet you hear the letters M and E tossed around all the time, right? And maybe you've even been asked to handle it without really being shown the ropes. Well, today we're going to demystify the whole thing. We're breaking it down to the absolute basics so you can see exactly why it's such a game changer for your daily work.
So, let's start with the basic premise of our work. Every project makes a promise. Think about that for a second. A water project promises clean water. A peace-building project promises calmer communities. And a farmer training project, it promises better harvests and higher incomes. M&E, which stands for monitoring and evaluation, is really just the structured way we figure out whether that promise was actually kept, and, what we learned along the way.
To make this super clear, let's ground this explainer in a real-world example. Imagine your organization is running a project to train, say, 200 farmers across a few different communities during a single farming season. Keep that number and that specific project tucked in the back of your mind as we go through this, because we're going to use it to see exactly how M&E plays out on the ground.
All right, part 1, monitoring, watching the journey. Let's start with the M. What is it, and what does it actually look like when you're out there in the field? Well, the really interesting thing is that monitoring is definitely not some end-of-year event. It's routine. It's totally continuous. Picture a field officer out in the community punching data into Kobo Toolbox on their phone. They're constantly checking in, asking, hey, did the improved seeds arrive on time, or are we actually reaching the women we set out to reach? The absolute crucial point here is that monitoring lets you catch problems early. If seeds are reaching 3 communities late, monitoring flags it in week 2. You can actually still fix it. Not at the end of the year when the whole farming season is basically a wash.
So, that's monitoring. Now let's shift gears to the second half of the equation, evaluation, judging the destination. Let's say that farmer training project we talked about costs 250,000 Ghana cedis over the season. Evaluation takes a big step back and asks the really hard questions. Did the farmer's yields and incomes actually improve? And, this is key, was that improvement actually caused by your training, or did they just have a fantastic rainy season? Most importantly, was the change big enough to justify spending that 250,000 cedis in the first place? So, where monitoring watches the daily delivery, evaluation stands back to judge the final results. And unlike monitoring, which is happening all the time, evaluation happens at 3 very specific set points. First, you take a baseline at the very start to record what farmers were harvesting before you even touched anything. Then you do a midline partway through just to check the pulse, and finally an end line at the close to measure exactly what changed.
I love this comparison because it brilliantly illustrates the core difference between the two. Monitoring asks, are we doing things right? While evaluation asks, did we do the right things? It's exactly like a road trip. Monitoring is watching the road, checking the fuel gauge, making sure you're on schedule while you're driving. Evaluation? That's standing at your destination, looking back, and asking yourself if the journey was actually worth taking.
So just to summarize everything we've covered so far at a glance, monitoring is continuous and it's heavily focused on delivery so you can catch those problems early. Evaluation, on the other hand, happens at set points, and it's focused on results and judging overall success. When you put them side by side like this, you can really see how perfectly they complement each other. But here's the crucial point. Why does this actually matter to you? I mean, if you're a busy NGO worker up in Yendi or Tamale juggling a dozen different tasks every single day, why should you care about this distinction? Well, let's move on and see exactly how this builds into your daily purpose. You've probably heard the term MEAL floating around the sector. It stands for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Now, the M and the E, those are just the tools you use, but the A and the L, accountability and learning, those are the true reasons why we actually do this work. Let's break those two down. First up, accountability. Look, your project handles resources that belong to other people. You literally have to prove, with solid evidence, that you use them exactly as you promised. And yes, this flows upward to funders like USAID or your local district assembly, but honestly, just as importantly, it flows downward to the rural folks you're serving. They have every right to know what was done in their name. And then, of course, there's learning. Honest reflection tells you what worked and what totally flopped, which makes your next project that much stronger. All right, moving to our final piece, the project cycle, which is a continuous loop. Now let's quickly dispel a very old myth here. For the longest time, M&E was treated as just, extra paperwork bolted onto the very end of a project just to make a donor report look good. But those days are completely over.
Rather than a straight line, it's a continuous circle that's naturally embedded into every single stage of the project cycle. You build it in right at the design stage, you carry out your continuous monitoring during implementation, and at closure, you evaluate and feed those hard-earned lessons straight back into the design of your next project. When it's done right, M&E is a continuous circle, not just some final chore you have to check off.
So, let's bring back our core analogy one last time. Monitoring watches the journey, evaluation judges the destination. Together, these two practices keep a project honest, and more importantly, they make it so much better. They are exactly how you ensure the communities you're working so hard to help are actually getting the support they were promised.
And I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time you sit down to design a community intervention, how will you prove you kept your promise? You've got to start thinking about the journey and the destination from day one. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope you feel empowered to put these tools to work in your own communities.